The woman thought it was just a stray cat, until it dropped a note that changed everything. Eleanor Ellie Reynolds, a woman of 68, lived a life of quiet routine in the small, coastal town of Seabrook, Oregon. Her days were structured around her small bookstore, the Book Nook, a haven of used books and the comforting scent of old paper and brewing coffee. She was a widow, her husband, George, having passed away 5 years prior, leaving a void in her life that books and the gentle rhythm of the ocean could only partially fill. She wasn't lonely, not exactly, but there was a stillness to her days, a sense of waiting for something she couldn't quite name. Seabrook was the kind of town where change happened slowly, if at all. The fishing boats still went out each morning, the tourists still flocked to the beaches in the summer, and the locals still gathered at the diner for gossip and coffee. Ellie knew most of them by name, her bookstore a regular stop for many. She was a fixture in the community, respected and liked, but also somewhat invisible, a quiet presence in the background. One chilly October evening, as Ellie was closing up the bookstore, she noticed a flash of orange fur darting across the street. It was a cat, a large, ginger Tom, looking thin and bedraggled. He was crouched beneath a parked car, his eyes wide and wary. Ellie wasn't particularly a cat person. She'd never owned a pet, finding the responsibility daunting. But there was something about this cat, a vulnerability in his gaze, that tugged at her heart. "Hey there, fella," she said softly, approaching cautiously. "Are you lost?" The cat didn't run. He just stared at her, his tail twitching nervously. He looked hungry, his ribs visible beneath his matted fur. Ellie sighed. She couldn't just leave him there. She went back inside the bookstore and found an old saucer and a can of tuna she kept for her own lunches. She poured some of the tuna onto the saucer and placed it on the sidewalk, a few feet from the car. "Come on," she coaxed. "It's okay." The cat hesitated for a moment, then slowly crept out from under the car. He approached the saucer cautiously, sniffing the air, then began to eat ravenously. Ellie watched him, a flicker of warmth spreading through her chest. As the cat ate, Ellie noticed he was limping slightly. One of his front paws seemed to be injured. She also noticed a small, dark stain on his fur, near his shoulder. It looked like dried blood. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The cat finished the tuna and looked up at Ellie, his golden eyes meeting hers. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, a silent plea that Ellie couldn't ignore. She made a decision. She couldn't leave him out here, injured and alone. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "You're coming home with me." She carefully scooped up the cat, surprised by his weight. He was surprisingly heavy, a solid mass of muscle beneath his scruffy fur. He didn't struggle, didn't hiss or scratch. He just nestled into her arms, as if he knew he was safe. Ellie locked up the bookstore and carried the cat to her small apartment above the shop. It was a cozy space, filled with books, comfortable furniture, and the quiet hum of the ocean. She placed the cat on the floor, and he immediately began to explore, his limp barely noticeable. Ellie watched him, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity filling her. She had just brought a stray cat into her home, a creature she knew nothing about. It was impulsive, out of character for her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had done the right thing. There was something about this cat, something more than just a stray, that had drawn her to him. She just didn't know what it was yet. Ellie made a makeshift bed for the cat in the corner of her living room, using an old blanket and a cardboard box. She filled a bowl with water and placed it beside the bed. The cat, whom she had tentatively started calling Rusty due to his orange fur, seemed to appreciate the accommodations. He explored the apartment cautiously, sniffing every corner, every piece of furniture, his tail held high. Ellie watched him, observing his behavior. He was clearly a street cat, wary and alert, but he also seemed to have a certain gentleness about him. He didn't scratch the furniture, didn't jump on the counters. He seemed to understand that he was a guest, that he was being offered a safe haven. Over the next few days, Ellie tended to Rusty's needs. She cleaned his injured paw, finding a small puncture wound that was thankfully not infected. She bought him proper cat food, and he ate with a gusto that suggested he hadn't had a decent meal in days. She also noticed that he was surprisingly well-groomed, despite his initial bedraggled appearance. He spent hours meticulously cleaning himself, his rough tongue smoothing his fur until it shone. Ellie found herself talking to Rusty, telling him about her day, about her bookstore, about George. It was a strange habit, talking to an animal, but it was also strangely comforting. Rusty would listen intently, his golden eyes fixed on her face, as if he understood every word. She also noticed some unusual things about Rusty's behavior. He was exceptionally quiet, rarely meowing. He seemed to be constantly observing, his gaze following Ellie as she moved around the apartment. He also had a peculiar habit of pawing at things, as if he were trying to move them or uncover something hidden. He would paw at books on the shelves, at cushions on the sofa, at the rug on the floor. One evening, as Ellie was reading in her armchair, Rusty was pawing at a small, decorative box on the coffee table. He kept pushing at it, his claws scrabbling against the smooth surface. "What is it, Rusty?" Ellie asked, amused. "What are you looking for?" Rusty just looked at her, his eyes intense, then went back to pawing at the box. Ellie chuckled and shook her head. "You're a strange one, aren't you?" She went back to her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Rusty's behavior was more than just random feline curiosity. There was a purposefulness to his actions, a sense of urgency that she couldn't quite understand. It was as if he were trying to tell her something, but she didn't know what it was. The feeling of unease, the subtle sense of mystery that had been building since she'd found Rusty, grew stronger. She found herself looking at him differently, wondering about his past, about where he had come from, about what he had been through. He was more than just a stray cat, she was sure of it. But what was he? And why had he chosen her? The answer came a few days later, in the most unexpected way. Ellie was preparing dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread. Rusty was sitting on the windowsill, watching the seagulls circling outside. He seemed unusually restless, his tail twitching back and forth, his body tense. Suddenly, he jumped down from the windowsill and began pawing at Ellie's feet. He meowed, a soft, plaintive sound, the first real meow she'd heard from him. "What is it, Rusty?" Ellie asked, bending down to pet him. "Are you hungry?" But Rusty wasn't interested in food. He kept pawing at her, his claws gently snagging on her slacks. Then, he did something that made Ellie's heart stop. He dropped a small, folded piece of paper at her feet. Ellie stared at the paper, her mind reeling. It was similar to the one in the previous story concept, old, yellowed, and creased. It looked like it had been tucked away somewhere for a long time. Rusty looked up at her, his golden eyes unwavering, as if urging her to pick it up. Ellie slowly bent down and picked up the paper. Her hands were trembling slightly. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. On the paper, written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, were a few words and a series of numbers. It wasn't a phone number this time. The words were, "They're watching. Warehouse 12, Pier 9. Below the words was a string of numbers, seemingly random, 234173839. Ellie stared at the note, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. This wasn't just a random piece of paper. This was a message. A desperate message. But from whom? And what did it mean? She looked at Rusty, who was watching her intently, his tail swishing slowly. He had brought her this note. He had deliberately dropped it at her feet. He was trying to tell her something, something important. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer just about a stray cat. This was something much bigger, much more serious. She was holding a piece of a puzzle, a clue to a mystery she didn't understand. She felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of determination. She couldn't ignore this. She couldn't pretend she hadn't seen it. She had to find out what it meant. She owed it to Rusty, and she owed it to whoever had written this desperate message. She looked around her cozy apartment, at the familiar bookshelves, the comfortable furniture, the peaceful view of the ocean. Her quiet, predictable life had just been shattered. She was being drawn into something unknown, something potentially dangerous. But she couldn't turn back. She had to follow this through, to unravel the mystery that Rusty, the orange cat, had brought to her doorstep. The note changed everything. Ellie spent a restless night, the note lying on her bedside table like a ticking bomb. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic message, "They're watching. Warehouse 12, Pier 9. And the numbers, 234173839. She knew Seabrook's waterfront well. Pier 9 was part of the old industrial district, a collection of dilapidated warehouses and rusting cranes, mostly abandoned now. It was a desolate, eerie place, even in daylight. What could possibly be happening there? And who were they? The numbers were even more perplexing. Were they a code? A combination? Coordinates? She had no idea. The next morning, Ellie decided to start with the obvious. She went down to her bookstore, but instead of opening for business, she went to her small office in the back. She called the Seabrook Police Department. She spoke to a dispatcher, a bored-sounding woman who seemed unimpressed by Ellie's story. Ellie explained about finding the cat, the note, and her concerns. "Ma'am," the dispatcher said, her voice laced with skepticism, "we get a lot of calls about stray animals. And sometimes, people find, well, strange things. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a crime involved." Ellie tried to explain the urgency in the note, the desperation she sensed in the handwriting, but the dispatcher remained unmoved. "Look, if you want to report a stray cat, you can call animal control," the dispatcher said. "But unless you have some actual evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do." Ellie hung up the phone, feeling frustrated and defeated. She had expected more, some show of concern, some willingness to investigate, but she was met with bureaucratic indifference. She then tried calling animal control, hoping they might have some information about a missing cat that matched Rusty's description. But the line was busy, and she eventually gave up. She felt alone, isolated. She had this potentially crucial piece of information, but no one seemed to take her seriously. She considered going to Pier 9 herself, but the thought terrified her. It was a dangerous place, especially for an elderly woman alone. She looked at Rusty, who was curled up on a chair in her office, watching her with his usual calm intensity. He seemed to sense her frustration, her fear. "What am I going to do, Rusty?" she whispered. "No one believes me." Rusty just blinked slowly, his golden eyes unwavering. Ellie decided to try a different approach. She went back to the note, studying the numbers again. She tried to think of any local significance they might have. Dates, addresses. Nothing seemed to fit. Then, she had an idea. She went to her computer and opened a search engine. She typed in Seabrook Pier 9 Warehouse 12. The results were mostly old news articles about the decline of the fishing industry and the planned redevelopment of the waterfront. Nothing that seemed relevant to the note. She tried different combinations of the numbers, searching for them as zip codes, phone numbers, even license plate numbers. Nothing. She was about to give up when she noticed a small, almost insignificant detail in one of the search results. It was a link to an archive page from the Seabrook Historical Society. The page was about the history of Pier 9. She clicked on the link, and her eyes scanned the text. Then, she saw it. A paragraph about the original construction of the warehouses on Pier 9. It mentioned that each warehouse had a unique identifying code, a combination of numbers used during the building process. Could the numbers on the note be one of these codes? It was a long shot, but it was the first lead she had. She carefully copied the numbers from the note and compared them to the codes listed on the Historical Society page. There was no direct match, but one of the codes was remarkably similar to 341739. Only one number was different. Ellie felt a surge of hope. Could this be it? Could the writer of the note have made a mistake, misremembering one digit of the code? It was possible, especially if they were writing in a hurry, under duress. She had a new avenue to explore, a potential connection between the note and the history of Pier 9. But she still needed help. She couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who knew Seabrook, someone who understood the local history, someone she could trust. Ellie thought of her regular customers at the Book Nook. There were many friendly faces, many people she chatted with regularly. But who among them could she confide in? Who would believe her? And who would be willing to help? Then, she remembered Thomas Ashton. Thomas was a retired history professor, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 70s. He was a regular at the bookstore, spending hours browsing the shelves, often engaging Ellie in long conversations about local history and obscure literary facts. He was a bit eccentric, with a tendency to go off on tangents, but he was also incredibly knowledgeable and possessed a sharp, inquisitive mind. Ellie had always found him fascinating, if a little intimidating. He was a widower, like herself, and lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of town. He had a reputation for being a bit of a recluse, but Ellie had always sensed a kindness beneath his gruff exterior. She decided to take a chance. She closed the bookstore early and drove to Thomas's cottage. It was a small, charming house, surrounded by a wild, overgrown garden. She found Thomas in his garden, tending to a patch of late-blooming roses. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "What brings you here?" Ellie hesitated, feeling a sudden wave of nervousness. She held out the note, her hand trembling slightly. "I need your help, Thomas," she said. "I found this, and I don't know what to do." Thomas took the note, his eyes narrowing as he read it. He looked at Ellie, his expression questioning. Ellie explained everything, from finding Rusty to the phone calls to the police and animal control, to her discovery on the Historical Society website. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other, her anxiety evident. Thomas listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face. When she was finished, he remained silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke. "This is quite extraordinary, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "And you believe this cat delivered this message?" Ellie nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, Thomas, but I know what I saw. And I feel like it's important." Thomas looked at the note again, then back at Ellie. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. He also saw a spark of determination, a refusal to be dismissed. He made a decision. "All right, Eleanor," he said. "I believe you, and I'll help you." Ellie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't realized how much she had been carrying the burden alone, how much she had needed someone to believe her. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." Thomas smiled, a rare and surprisingly warm smile. "Don't mention it, my dear," he said. "Now, let's see what we can make of this." He invited her inside his cottage, which was even more cluttered than she had imagined. Books lined every wall, piled on tables, stacked on the floor. It was a chaotic mess, but it also felt strangely comforting, a reflection of Thomas's inquisitive mind. They sat at a small table, surrounded by books, and began to examine the note more closely. Thomas, with his knowledge of local history, was able to provide context and insights that Ellie had missed. He confirmed that the numbers were likely a variation of the old warehouse codes. He also explained that Pier 9 had a dark history, rumored to be a site of smuggling and other illegal activities during the Prohibition era. "This note," Thomas said, tapping the paper with a gnarled finger, "suggests that something is still going on there. Something someone doesn't want discovered." Ellie shivered. The reality of the situation was becoming clearer and more frightening. She wasn't just dealing with a stray cat and a cryptic note. She was potentially uncovering a dangerous secret, a secret someone was willing to protect at any cost. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Thomas, and unlikely ally, a man of knowledge and quiet strength. Together, they would unravel the mystery, piece by piece. The game was afoot. With Thomas as her partner, Ellie felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. They spent hours poring over the note and researching the history of Pier 9. Thomas's cottage became their impromptu headquarters, the cluttered living room transformed into a makeshift investigation center. Thomas, with his extensive knowledge of local history, was able to identify the most likely warehouse corresponding to the code on the note, even with the one differing number. It was indeed Warehouse 12, a large, dilapidated structure at the far end of Pier 9. He also discovered that the warehouse had changed ownership several times over the years, the current owner being a somewhat shadowy corporation called Coastal Holdings LLC. Coastal Holdings, Thomas mused, stroking his chin. "I've heard that name before. They've been buying up a lot of property around Seabrook lately, but no one seems to know much about them." Ellie felt a growing sense of unease. The more they learned, the more suspicious the situation seemed. They decided to focus on the numbers on the note, 2341789. Thomas, after much deliberation, suggested they might be a book cipher, a code where numbers refer to words or letters within a specific book. "It's an old method," he explained, "but it can be quite effective. The key is finding the right book." The question was, which book? Ellie and Thomas spent hours brainstorming, considering any possible connection between the note, the cat, and a specific book. They looked through Ellie's bookstore inventory, focusing on books about the local area, maritime history, or anything that might relate to warehouses or codes. They came up empty. Then, Ellie remembered something. Rusty's habit of pawing at things, particularly books. "Thomas," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Rusty. He used to paw at books. He seemed particularly interested in one book in my apartment. It was an old copy of Moby Dick." Thomas's eyes lit up. "Moby Dick," he said. "Of course. A classic tale of the sea, of obsession, of hidden dangers. It's certainly plausible." Ellie rushed back to her apartment, Rusty following at her heels. She found the copy of Moby Dick, a worn, leather-bound edition that had belonged to George. She brought it back to Thomas's cottage. They began the painstaking process of deciphering the numbers, using Moby Dick as their key. They started by assuming the numbers referred to page line word. So, the 17th of April 23 would mean page 23, line 4, word 17. The first few attempts yielded gibberish. But then, on the third try, using a slightly different interpretation of the numbers page paragraph word, they found something. The 17th of April 23, hidden 8 to 39, treating it as a new line, cargo. Ellie and Thomas stared at each other, their hearts pounding. "Hidden cargo," Thomas whispered. "It fits. It makes sense." They continued deciphering, working meticulously through the rest of the numbers. It took hours, but finally, they had a complete message. "Hidden cargo. Beware. Informant." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. This was more than just a cryptic note. This was a warning. Someone, the informant, was trying to expose something hidden at Warehouse 12, something dangerous. And they, whoever they were watching. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was increasingly ominous. They had a location, Warehouse 12, Pier 9. They had a possible motive, hidden cargo. And they had a warning, beware. They knew they had to go to Pier 9 to see for themselves what was happening at Warehouse 12. But they also knew they had to be careful. They were dealing with something potentially dangerous, something someone wanted to keep secret. Ellie and Thomas decided to visit Pier 9 the next day, during daylight hours. They reasoned that it would be less risky than going at night, and they would be able to get a better sense of the layout of the warehouse. They drove to the pier in Thomas's old, battered Volvo, a car that seemed as eccentric and resilient as its owner. The pier was deserted, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The warehouses loomed large, their rusted metal siding creaking in the wind. It was a bleak and settling place. They parked a short distance from Warehouse 12 and approached on foot. The warehouse was massive, its windows boarded up, its doors secured with heavy chains and padlocks. There were no signs of activity, no cars or trucks nearby. "It looks abandoned," Ellie whispered, her voice filled with apprehension. "Perhaps," Thomas replied, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "But we should be cautious." They circled the warehouse, trying to find a way to see inside. They found a small, broken window at the back, partially obscured by overgrown weeds. Thomas carefully cleared away the weeds, and they peered inside. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with shadows. They could make out stacks of crates and barrels, but it was difficult to see clearly. Suddenly, they heard a noise, a metallic clang, followed by the sound of voices. It was coming from inside the warehouse. Ellie and Thomas froze, their hearts pounding. They weren't alone. They crouched down, hiding behind a pile of discarded tires. They listened intently, trying to make out what was being said. The voices were muffled, but they could hear the distinct sound of anger, of argument. Then, a single word, clear and chilling, "cargo." Ellie and Thomas exchanged a look of alarm. They had stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. Suddenly, a large truck roared to life nearby. The engine revved, and the truck sped away from the warehouse, its tires screeching on the pavement. Ellie and Thomas remained hidden, waiting until the sound of the truck faded away. Then, cautiously, they emerged from their hiding place. "We need to leave," Thomas said, his voice urgent. "Now." They hurried back to Thomas's car, their adrenaline pumping. As they drove away from the pier, Ellie noticed a dark sedan parked on a side street, its windows tinted. The car seemed to be watching them. Ollie pointed it out to Thomas. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression grim. "Don't look back," he said. "Just keep driving." They drove in silence for several minutes, the tension thick in the air. They both knew they had been seen, that their investigation had been noticed. They were no longer just observers, they were players in a dangerous game. They returned to Thomas's cottage, feeling shaken and vulnerable. They had confirmed their suspicions something illegal was happening at Warehouse 12. But they had also alerted them, whoever they were, to their presence. "We're in danger, Thomas," Ellie said, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded, his face pale. "I know," he said, "but we can't back down now. We have to find out what's going on, and we have to stop it." They were in over their heads, two elderly people caught up in a dangerous conspiracy. But they were determined to see it through, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The stakes had just gotten a lot higher. Back at Thomas's cottage, Ellie and Thomas felt a mix of fear and determination. They knew they couldn't go to the police, they had no concrete proof, only a cryptic note and a strong suspicion. And after Ellie's initial attempt, they doubted the police would take them seriously. They were on their own. "We need more information," Thomas said, pacing the cluttered living room. "We need to know what's in that warehouse, what that cargo is." Ellie agreed. But how? They couldn't simply break into Warehouse 12. That was too risky. They needed a plan, a way to gather evidence without putting themselves in immediate danger. Then, Ellie remembered something. "The Seabrook Historical Society," she said. "They might have blueprints or old photographs of the warehouse. Something that could give us a clue about what's inside, or maybe even a secret entrance." Thomas nodded, his eyes lighting up. "That's an excellent idea, Eleanor. They might also have records of previous owners, which could help us understand Coastal Holdings LLC better." They decided to visit the Historical Society the next morning. In the meantime, Thomas suggested they research Coastal Holdings LLC online, trying to find any information about the company, its owners, or its business activities. The research proved frustrating. Coastal Holdings was a shell corporation, its ownership hidden behind layers of legal obfuscation. They found no website, no phone number, no physical address other than a P.O. box in a nearby city. It was as if the company existed only on paper. The next morning, they went to the Seabrook Historical Society, a small, unassuming building tucked away on a side street. They spoke to the volunteer archivist, a friendly, elderly woman named Agnes, who was delighted to help them with their research project. Agnes, after hearing their slightly fabricated story about researching the history of Seabrook's waterfront, led them to a back room filled with dusty files and boxes. She helped them locate old maps, blueprints, and photographs of Pier 9 and Warehouse 12. They spent hours poring over the documents. They discovered that Warehouse 12 had originally been built to store fish and ice, but it had been used for various purposes over the years, including a brief stint as a military supply depot during World War II. Then, they found something significant. A blueprint from the 1940s showed a small, hidden room within the warehouse, accessible only through a concealed door in the basement. The room was labeled simply as storage. "This could be it," Thomas said, his voice excited. "This could be where they're keeping the hidden cargo." Ellie felt a surge of hope. They had a potential entry point, a way to get inside the warehouse without being detected. But as they were leaving the Historical Society, Agnes, the archivist, stopped them. "I almost forgot," she said. "There was a gentleman here a few weeks ago, asking about Warehouse 12. He said he was from Coastal Holdings. He was very interested in the old blueprints, particularly any that showed hidden rooms." Ellie and Thomas exchanged a look of alarm. They knew about the hidden room, and they were one step ahead. They returned to Thomas's cottage, their minds racing. They had to act quickly. They decided to go back to Pier 9 that night, armed with the blueprint and a plan. Their plan was simple, but risky. Thomas, using his knowledge of the area and the blueprint, would locate the hidden entrance to the basement. Ellie would act as a lookout, using her small size and inconspicuous appearance to blend in with the shadows. If they found anything, they would photograph it as evidence and then leave, contacting the authorities, not the local police, but the FBI with their findings. Under the cover of darkness, they returned to Pier 9. The warehouse loomed large and menacing, its silhouette stark against the night sky. The air was thick with tension and the smell of salt and decay. Following the blueprint, Thomas located the hidden entrance, a small, metal door concealed behind a pile of crumbling bricks. The door was locked, but Thomas, using a set of lockpicking tools he'd surprisingly produced from his coat pocket, one never knows when such skills might be useful, he'd said with a twinkle in his eye, managed to open it. The door led to a narrow, dark staircase that descended into the basement. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was unnerving. Ellie stayed at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, while Thomas cautiously descended. She held a small flashlight, ready to signal him if she saw anything suspicious. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Ellie strained her ears, listening for any sound. Then, she heard a muffled thud, followed by a curse. She panicked. "Thomas," she whispered urgently. "Are you all right?" There was a moment of silence, then Thomas's voice, strained but reassuring. "I'm fine. Just tripped. But you need to see this." Ellie, her fear battling with her curiosity, carefully descended the stairs. She found Thomas in a large, dimly lit room, filled with crates. The crates were marked with strange symbols and foreign writing. Thomas pointed to one of the crates, which had been partially opened. Inside, nestled in packing material, were rows of small, plastic-wrapped packages. Thomas carefully pulled out one of the packages. He unwrapped it, revealing a white, powdery substance. "Drugs," he whispered, his voice filled with horror. "This is a drug smuggling operation." Ellie gasped. She had suspected something illegal, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Suddenly, they heard voices coming from the main part of the warehouse. They were getting closer. "We need to go," Ellie whispered urgently. "Now." Thomas quickly took several photographs of the crates and the open package. Then, they hurried back up the stairs, closing the hidden door behind them. They were just emerging from behind the pile of bricks when they saw two men approaching the warehouse. The men were large and imposing, their faces grim. They were carrying flashlights and what looked like weapons. Ellie and Thomas froze, their hearts pounding. They were trapped. One of the men spotted them. "Hey," he shouted. "What are you doing here?" Ellie and Thomas knew they couldn't run. They were too old to slow. They were caught. The men approached them, their expressions menacing. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. Ellie, summoning all her courage, stepped forward. "We know what you're doing," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We know about the drugs." The men exchanged a look. One of them chuckled. "You don't know anything, old woman." Then, Thomas stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "We know enough," he said, his voice firm. "And we're going to the authorities." The men laughed. "You think the cops will believe you?" one of them sneered. "We have friends in high places." Suddenly, a bright light shone in the men's faces, blinding them. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "This is the FBI. Drop your weapons and put your hands in the air." Ellie and Thomas were stunned. They hadn't contacted the FBI yet. How? Then, they saw Rusty. The orange cat was sitting on top of a nearby building, silhouetted against the night sky. Beside him stood a figure, holding a mobile phone. It was a young woman, with short dark hair. The woman spoke into the phone again. "We have the suspects surrounded. Do not resist." The men, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned, reluctantly dropped their weapons and put their hands in the air. FBI agents swarmed the area, securing the warehouse and arresting the men. The young woman approached Ellie and Thomas, a smile on her face. "Are you all right?" she asked. Ellie and Thomas nodded, still speechless. "I'm Agent Ramirez," the woman said. "We've been tracking this operation for months." The note the cat delivered, it was from one of our informants. He was working undercover, but he got made. He knew he was in danger, so he entrusted the message to the cat, hoping it would find its way to someone who could help. Ellie looked at Rusty, who was now purring loudly, rubbing against Agent Ramirez's legs. He had been a courier, a secret agent, all along. The numbers on the note, Agent Ramirez continued, were a coded reference to our informant's case file. We were able to decrypt it, but we didn't know his location. Your information about Warehouse 12 was the missing piece of the puzzle. Ellie and Thomas were overwhelmed. They had stumbled into a major FBI operation, and they had played a crucial role in bringing it down. The events at Pier 9 made headlines in the local news, and even garnered some national attention. Ellie and Thomas were hailed as heroes, the likely duo who had helped crack a major drug smuggling ring. Ellie was interviewed by several newspapers and television stations. She told the story of Rusty, the brave orange cat who had delivered the crucial message, and of Thomas, her courageous and resourceful partner. Thomas, ever the recluse, shunned the spotlight, preferring to remain in the background. But he couldn't avoid the gratitude of the FBI, who presented him with a special commendation for his assistance. Rusty, of course, became a local celebrity. He was featured in numerous articles, his photo gracing the front pages of newspapers. He received offers of adoption from all over the country, but Ellie knew he already had a home. He chose her. The informant, whose name was revealed to be Michael, was rescued from a safe house and reunited with his family. He expressed his deep gratitude to Ellie and Thomas, thanking them for saving his life. Coastal Holdings LLC was shut down, its assets seized by the government. Several high-ranking officials were arrested, their connections to the drug smuggling operation exposed. Life in Seabrook slowly returned to normal, but things were different for Ellie. She was no longer just the quiet bookstore owner. She was a local hero, a woman of courage and determination. She had found a new sense of purpose and new confidence in herself. She and Thomas remained close friends, their bond strengthened by their shared adventure. They often met for coffee, discussing local history and, occasionally, reminiscing about their daring exploits at Pier 9. Ellie continued to run her bookstore, but she also started volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping to find homes for stray cats. She knew that every cat had a story, a potential for heroism, just like Rusty. One day, Agent Ramirez paid a visit. She brought some official papers and asked Ellie to sign, which Rusty legally adopted to her. Rusty, curled up on Ellie's lap, purred contentedly. He was home, safe and loved. He had found his forever person, and Ellie had found a friend, a companion, a hero in the most unexpected of places. The quiet stillness of her life had been replaced by a vibrant energy, a sense of connection, a reminder that even in the smallest of towns, and the most ordinary of lives, extraordinary things could happen. And sometimes, all it took was a stray orange cat and a crumpled piece of paper to change everything.